14 p.m. Town Council meeting, special session. Talk about product redevelopment.
Councilman Tucker?
Here.
Councilman Kennahan?
Here.
Councilman Padula? Council Vice President Giroux?
Here.
Council President Goslin?
Here.
There's a quorum. Discussion regarding the proposed tax stabilization ordinance for the Arctic Village Redevelopment District.
Frank.
So this is, actually, I'll just turn it over to Mark or Bob to give you the introduction, but the redevelopment agency's been working on a proposed ordinance that'll basically incentivize development in the district, and so they put a draft together, and really at this stage, I think they're just looking for comments, but I'll let Mark take it from here.
Mr. Council President, council members, Mark Carullo, Town Planner. And I want to say thank you for having us here tonight. As you know, we were here, I think it was a week or so ago, looking for some feedback on an ordinance that is being forwarded to the council from the redevelopment agency. And as you also know, the redevelopment agency has been working within the redevelopment district on trying to catalyze development within the district. And one of the items that we spent the last year on was some enabling legislation authorizing the town council to go forward with what is referred to as tax stabilization agreements. That was passed, and since that point, the redevelopment agency has been working on some language for a proposed ordinance. The redevelopment agency at its last meeting suggested through a majority of the group that we should forward the draft document to the town council for feedback. We don't want to be coming before the council with a document that is contrary to what the council's thoughts are, what the council is looking for. So we're looking to collaborate with the town council. But the first step in that is apparently the agency creating a draft ordinance presented for your information and for your feedback. And as I was here at the last meeting, it was suggested to me that we provide an executive summary. I've provided that to you gentlemen here this evening. And if you would like, we can go through that point by point. It basically highlights aspects of the proposed ordinance as it is currently written in its draft form. So if you want to go through that, I can go through those bullet points now. Basically, the first bullet point is just referring to the enabling legislation and under what authority the council would have to adopt an ordinance, and that is Rhode Island General Law 44-3-9.9, which is specific to the town of West Warwick. The proposed ordinance is a tax stabilization or tax exemption ordinance that can be authorized by the town council, only by the town council, upon the recommendation of the redevelopment agency for a period up to but not exceeding 20 years. And basically what that means is if a project comes in and the council desires to give it the full benefit of the 20 years, it can do that, or it can scale it back to any time frame that it sees fit that may be less than 20 years. So the way that the ordinance is currently written is there's a sliding scale, and it's basically worded as up to 20 years. The next point that we wanted to hit on is that the eligible properties will only receive exemption if they have projects that have been reviewed and approved by the redevelopment agency and then forwarded to this council for consideration. The council has the only the council has the authority to actually approve the tax stabilization agreements in whatever form the council desires to approve those. Projects would be eligible to freeze taxes at the pre-development assessment, and that's the verbiage that is currently being proposed in the ordinance. And basically what that means is, most of the properties as they exist today are assessed at a current value, and the hope is through redevelopment that someone will come in and either improve the existing properties to a higher value, obviously, or maybe even raise the properties and build a new property that would be at a higher value. So what the proposal is, in order to incentivize the new development in town as it exists today, is to freeze the values at what we would call the pre-development value. So that's the value as it exists today. And any new building or any improvements to the property would be a benefit to the developer as not seeing an increase in taxes. Again, that's on a sliding scale, and it can be up to a maximum of 20 years or any portion of that in between. Again, that's up to the council and the redevelopment agency. It also includes what would be commonly referred to and has been over the last year and a half or so as the redevelopment agency has come before the council of what has been referred to as a pilot, and that's a payment in lieu of taxes. This is kind of a hybrid version of that. A typical pilot is something where someone pays no taxes and they make a payment that is in place of taxes, whether that payment be a lump sum payment or an annual payment, but it has no basis for taxes. It's a negotiated sum. The way that this ordinance is currently written is that upon transfer of the property, if a developer comes in and builds a new development and sells that property, that the town would be eligible to receive up to, but not exceeding, a maximum of 7.5%. And it's almost like a real estate commission, although it's not, because we're not involved in marketing and selling the property. We're just involved in approving a tax stabilization agreement, and a byproduct of that would be the ability of the town to negotiate with a developer for some sort of a lump sum payment that would offset the 20-year freezing of the taxes, if that makes sense to you. If it doesn't, we do have a scenario that I will go through in a minute that the chairman created over the last couple of days to kind of give you a better understanding of how that program would work.
Hey, Mark, can I interrupt you
Yes.
for 1 second? With what you just said in mind, we're giving them a tax break, but we're asking them for a 7% sales tax?
A 7% one-time lump sum payment upon the sale. Yes, and good question. The answer to that question is yes. And it's kind of a hybrid of what's being presented. And let's just work through this, and then I'll go through the scenario so
Okay.
you get a better understanding of how it will work, Councilman. The next bullet, basically, lease properties. If a developer is going to build a property and lease it and not sell it, there is a provision in there that would allow the town to receive up to 6% of the net operating costs. Again, that's similar to the bullet prior to. That would offset the freezing of the taxes at the pre-development cost, pre-development value, I'm sorry. And last, existing property owners, so those individuals who may live in residential properties or have properties that they want to retain would be eligible for a tax stabilization agreement, but only if they made an investment in their property of a minimum of 50% of the current value of the property. So basically, if your property is worth $100,000, you'd have to make a $50,000 improvement to that property to qualify. And again, the taxes would be frozen at that new rate, the post-development rate, $150,000 for 20 years, and there is no provision for the rent or the sale for that aspect. So that basically lays out the highlights of what's being proposed, what has been written. And if you have any questions, I know the councilman had a question about that. I'll be willing to answer some of those now, but if not, I would like to go into the projection of a sample of a potential development that could happen within the district. Yes, Mr. Williams.
Is going to define what these terms mean regarding pre-development asset assessment value, gross sales price, annual net operating income, because if you leave it to two different parties, there's going to be two different interpretations, and that's going to cause trouble. That's number one. And regarding the lump sum payment, I'm assuming that's going to take place at the closing. Who's going to be responsible for paying that? Which entity, the buyer or the seller?
Okay.
And is that negotiable?
Those are good questions, Mr. Williamson. So
Just wanted to give you some time to think.
typically, in ordinance, and as you know, as well as I do, many times in ordinances, terms are defined. They don't happen to be defined in this ordinance, but duly noted, and I would suggest that we do define those terms, and that those terms be based on terms of the trade. I'm not a realtor, but I know that there are terms of trade, and I know there are terms of trade for assessed value through the tax assessor's office, so I would think we would extract those definitions and import them into the ordinance as a definition section.
Okay, and the other question I have is, there's going to be a generalized tax stabilization agreement for the entire area, but then each project is going to have its own individual tax stabilization agreement, correct?
Yeah, so the way the ordinance is written is the ordinance lays a framework. It has parameters in it, and there's a sliding scale within that. So what the agency is suggesting, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion, I know Councilman Gosselin has some opinions on this, as he stated them previously. What the agency is suggesting is that the council adopt the parameters of the ordinance, and basically, when a developer comes in, then they negotiate within those parameters, and that is the sliding scale, whether it be 20 years, whether it be 10 years, whether it be 6%, whether it be 2%, all of those are up to but not exceeding, so that, in the opinion of the agency, someone coming in would know basically the rules of the game, if you may, rather than each developer coming in and negotiating totally different agreements for different properties and different developments. There are two ways to go, and I know Councilman Gosselin mentioned that, if someone comes in and they have this wonderful project, the town council may be willing to give them the benefit of a better agreement as opposed to Joe's taxi stand, and I think that's the example that he used on a couple of occasions. Coming in, it's like, listen, we're not going to give Joe's taxi stand the same benefit. We're going to give, a medical office building coming in here.
My last question is, does the agency envision this being open-ended, so it could be open for 20 years, so projects can be, or is it going to be just a closed-in period of time? You have 5 years to apply for project status. How is that going to work out?
It's envisioned to be open-ended and projects accepted on a rolling basis.
Mark, going back to your sliding scale, to take, what I want to say, the politics out of it, your sliding scale, would that be something to the effect that, let's say the building is a $100,000 building, and okay, on $100,000 on the sliding scale gives you a 5-year incentive, but it's $1 million building, and that gives you 10 years on the incentive, and it's a $5 million building, 20-year incentive. Is that the type of sliding scale you're looking at, or?
No. To give you a direct answer, no. That is not the type of sliding scale. And the sliding scale, for lack of a better term, and you mentioned, taking politics out of it, is somewhat subjective. And that is, what is the desire of the agency and what do they think is an appropriate project worthy of a larger tax incentive. So to answer your question, no, that is something, we're looking for feedback, and if that's something that the council would like to see, that is certainly something we would consider.
The reason why I like that type of scale is 2 years, nobody's here. Who knows? We don't know. Mr. Boyer, Mrs. Tabak, they have developments going on. Well, I have an issue with Mr. Boyer. I don't like it. Well, I shouldn't take the politics out of it. And Bob, I like you, by the way.
He actually doesn't.
Take the politics out of it, where they can come back and say, this is the type of building they're putting on, this is the scale, and this is where they should be. And, that's why I think that should be that type of sliding scale. That way there's no, hard feelings, or somebody dislikes somebody, or somebody doesn't like that particular type of business, or whatever, and they just don't want it here, So that's something I'd like to see worked on, if you have something like that.
Yeah, there are, when you look at tax incentive agreements from community to community, they're structured differently, but, there are those that require a minimum investment to qualify. Many of them are defined. The town currently has a tax stabilization agreement for the office park, and that is clearly defined as frozen value the first year, and then a phase-in of taxes, 20% a year, 20, 40, 60, 80 till you get 100. So it's basically a 6-year tax stabilization plan. And I know that that's been implemented time and time again by this council. So, yeah, I do
Yeah.
clearly hear what you're saying, and this does not include that type of a scale, but that's good feedback.
That's the one that to me seems to make the most sense.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, and I don't know where the pilot program idea came from, but just for clarification's sake, is this like options that a developer would have, or somebody that's owning a property? Would they say, I want to choose the pilot program as opposed to the pre-development assessed value? So instead of paying taxes for a certain amount of time, they would pay that one-time fee to the town and then pay no taxes to the town?
That is not the way it is currently structured, Councilman, no.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, sure, Joe.
Thank you, honorable members of the council. For the record, Attorney K. Joseph Shikachi. I'm the attorney for the Arctic Redevelopment Agency. And Mark's done a wonderful job explaining it. I just want to bring up a couple of points. The way this was envisioned for the agency is ultimately this council, the head political body of the town, would make the final decision. And what we're proposing is a framework, as Mark said, in a sliding scale, not necessarily for the amount of investment, but really the type of the use. For example, as Mark said, and I'll just use two extreme examples, like Metropolitan Life. If Metropolitan Life wanted to come into West Warwick and they wanted to make a substantial investment, you may want to entice them by giving them the broadest possible benefit you could give. Whereas if it was a Taco Bell, which is nice and it's still new and it looks good and it's still an investment, you may not want to give them the biggest possible tax break. So it would depend, and the way the authority, the Arctic Redevelopment Agency views this as, they would have the first review of a project, and they would ultimately send it to the council for final determination. So you would make the final determination of how much of a benefit, whether you wanted to waive not only or reduce or put a tax treaty, but waive automobile taxes, if a company can, or waive other stuff. Ultimately, like an inventory tax. You as the council would have the decision, but this would help us, in terms of the agency, go out and recruit a business to say, look, here's a blueprint. You can qualify from A to Z, somewhere in between. It depends on how much of an investment, how big your project is, what kind of jobs you're going to bring to the town, and is it going to be in such a kind of a business that brings in other tenants, other users. For example, if you were able to secure a Walmart, there are certain types of business that likes to be near Walmart because they can work off the traffic flow from Walmart. So ultimately, this is a framework. The agency's looking for input from you. I think this meeting is a good meeting. And that's pretty much the source of it. For example, we want to be able to give the town council, that was part of the enabling legislation, enough tools in its toolbox to make a decision. The state went out and recruited General Electric to come here to Rhode Island for a host of different kinds of tax incentives. Ultimately, the state, the Commerce Department, made a package together that was attractive to Lure GE, and we envisioned the same thing. The council would make a package individualized to particular use, whether it was the Joe's Taxi Cab Stab or it was somebody else. Now, I've appeared before this council in my private capacity, and I represented Belize 3 years ago. And Belize Subaru came here, and they got a tax stabilization from this honorable body to recruit them to come here and develop a parcel of land that had been otherwise left undeveloped for many years. I think at the time, Mr. Presley was the town planner. He supported it. I don't remember if there was a town manager. Maybe you were just the beginning of the town manager. But that they provided a high-service water line that went down there, helped develop the project, helped increase the value, and brought jobs and tangible taxes to the town. So there was like a cost-benefit analysis that the town does. Your town manager, your city solicitor, your planning board, everybody would look at a particular project and say, and then make a recommendation. Ultimately, the way that enabling legislation, and the way we envision it from an agency, you as the town would make the final decision. We would have the chore or the charge, so to speak, to go out, recruit businesses come in here and then say, this is what we'd recommend to the town council, and try to get the highest and best users to the property, to the area, and to Arctic.
But doesn't the authority already have the ability to meet with a developer, or meet with a prospective business owner and suggest ideas to the council?
Yes, we do.
Because the concern that I have is I feel like we're creating these scenarios that, I don't want to say bind our hands, because they don't, because it ultimately comes back to us, but just by passing the ordinance, we're suggesting that we're okay with these situations, when some of them, and I'm not
Sure.
big into business development, but I can tell that some of them are going to be very beneficial to somebody doing a certain kind of project, whereas others might not be. So a developer's just going to pick which one they think helps them the most, which essentially creates the least amount of tax revenue for the town, which is the purpose of redeveloping
Yes,
Arctic.
that's exactly the intent, but there's a deliberate purpose behind that, is to go out and recruit new business, new jobs into this area, which has been economically challenged, to say the least, for many, many years. So you're 100% right, Councilman. We want to have an ordinance in place that we can use as a marketing tool to say, if you come here, because quite frankly, a lot of businesses haven't looked at Arctic because of the geographic nature, the distance from the highways to get here, the traffic pattern, they do a radius map of so many miles and the household income. There's a lot of challenges here, so we need to entice businesses to come here. And to be quite frank, and again, in my private capacity, last night I passed a tax stabilization for the city of Warwick, and we just amended it, included it, and Providence is doing it, the state's doing it. We, speaking for somebody who now works for the town, we can't sit back and let these other communities do this and not have West Warwick have the same ability. Again, ultimately, we, as the agency, are not doing anything. We're making a recommendation. The planning board would make a department recommendation. Your solicitor, your town manager would all weigh in, and ultimately you'd make the decision. It's our job to go out and entice these people, get them here. If we have a framework, we can do that. Sure, Tim.
I think, if I'm hearing this right, the scope of the ordinance is going to allow the agency to act much like a headhunter acts.
That's
The
correct.
headhunter goes out, recruits individuals for jobs, but ultimately it's the business that negotiates the terms and conditions for employment. So although the ordinance is going to allow you to do certain things, it's not going to be finalized, which means even if you're acting as in a headhunter capacity and Mr. Boyer wants to bring in, say, Nathan's Hot Dogs, and Nathan's Hot Dogs is only going to build something that might be $130,000, the town can say, we don't want Nathan's Hot Dogs.
That's correct. You
And
can say.
Mr. Boyer would know that coming in.
Well, you would say something
However,
like,
if
we
John-
don't want to
if
give.
John Semino-
No, we don't
if
want
John-
to give the incentive.
That's exactly right,
John
Councilman.
Semino came
Can't
in and
stop
said
them
for
from
the
coming.
same place. Oh, no, but if
Yeah.
John Semino, again, headhunting, if John came in with Walmart, and like you said, those other businesses, then the town may say, he's in a better position.
Yes.
But ultimately, the town council.
The town council will
final
make
say.
the final say. That's the point I want to emphasize. You're giving us the tools to go out and sell and market, but we cannot execute. Only the town could actually execute a tax treaty.
I guess my
Town
only,
council.
my only, sorry.
That's right, go
ahead. No, I guess my only question is then why are we stating these things so specifically, where
Be-
you can just go out and offer them anyway and come back to us with the
be-
proposal?
Because
Be-
that
Have to have a
allows,
baseline,
that
I
allows the prospective investor to really know.
Yeah.
Basically,
It's not
basically,
completely open.
you know 51 of the cards in the deck. The only one you don't know is whether or not the council's going to approve it. Other cities and towns' ordinances, you might only have 10 cards in the deck. You're going to spend tremendous amount of money trying to market your proposal to the town. There's all sorts of soft cost involved, and they're going to want to know, well, why would I spend that type of money
Thank you.
if we're
It's,
not going to get
it's
the result
expensive.
we're looking for? It is, yeah.
It's very expensive to go out and recruit and to come here and develop plans and to pay lawyers and architects and engineers to look at a parcel, do its due diligence. They want to know the town, you give an indication by passing a framework ordinance that if you meet this criteria, you were eligible to receive between A and, say, J. You're not going to get A to Z, but you're eligible, and then it's up the town council will decide. And that's the intent, is by you passing it, it says we're open for business, because any developer, the worst thing you can do is, delay. You have to go to the planning board, you have to go to the zoning board, you have to go to redevelopment agency, you have to go to the town council. But they don't mind going through those processes when they have a comfort level of feeling that, yes, they passed the ordinance, the town was open for business, they want us to come.
So knowing what other communities are doing or have done, do we have the edge at all with
Well,
this?
this is very broad. I will tell you this. Warwick's enabling ordinance, which was passed in May, that was expanded last night, is only for 10 years. And it's only for a certain area. The original area was around the transportation intermodal zone around the airport. It last night was expanded to include historical properties. So, and that's what Warwick is. The state is a little bit broader. They can offer programs all over the state, but they can also offer a greater incentive if you're going into an industry which they consider high growth, high yield, high tech, for example. If you're going to bring in a high tech, PayPal, a high tech, you get an added bonus because it's a kind of a business that they want to encourage as growth. It's startup type businesses.
Is the provision?
It's about and Warwick's minimum investment is $5 million. And the other issue about Warwick, just because you asked, Councilman, thank you, Mark, is that in the Warwick situation, you're only eligible to get a tax stabilization from the city if you have received tax credits from the state. So you have to go meet the state criteria. You have to be in a historic district or in the transportation intermodal district in Warwick, which is that area around the airport, and then you're eligible to receive that tax
So
stabilization.
there's at least one less hoop
Yes.
that they have to jump through. The provision here, looking at the executive summary, on the lump sum payment provision, and also the ordinance, the
That's
second one.
a better way.
Is that a common, is that in other provisions?
No,
to your
that's not.
knowledge?
I don't know.
Is that a unique piece for West Warwick?
I believe it is, and
Okay.
what it is I believe it's a recapture. It's a recapture upon sale, because now the developer, this is the way this lump sum is intended to work, upon sale of the property. So a developer comes in, he builds a development for whatever, and then 4, 5, 6 years in there with a tax treaty, he decides to sell it to a REIT. And that's great. So, but the town should be able to recapture some amount of money. And then let me just tell you, the amount, this was proposed to us, the agency, this 7.5%, that can change. And the money that says, 1/2 to the police and 1/2 to the fire, 1/2 to the senior, that's suggested language. That can go to you guys can decide, well, look, we want to spend it for schools. We want to spend it for, our pension liability. We want to no, but I'm trying to say you have the ability to spend.
There's a lot of, and you're right, there's a lot of things. I mean, that was one of the first things that I looked at. I don't know why that's there, telling us what we have to spend it on, because there's a lot of worthwhile things.
Yeah, ultimately,
the
you
senior
could-
center, we already own we already carry the mortgage for that. We own the building now.
You can put it in your general fund.
I mean, I
Yeah,
had suggested, when I first saw this, I sent it back, and I think I had suggested possibly we would take that money, make it restricted, but for something, I mean, like maybe our infrastructure, maybe for building
Whatever you
refurbs, for the police, fire, and senior center, maybe to help
you
pay
can
off the
use it
mortgage
for
in the
you
senior
could use
center.
it for whatever you want.
Or even
Okay, well, so
reinvestment
then-
in the redevelopment authority itself.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Because I guess the issue that I have is just from a finance perspective, it just seems, we're trying to keep such a close, tight view on what's going on with our budgets. These sales messing with budgets and revenues and causing all these things, it just seems like we're asking for trouble. So that's a part that I'd like to see.
This we're here asking you guys. This is our first draft of what we propose. Give us your comments. Give us a second draft. Doesn't have to be tonight or tomorrow or this week, and then we'll come back and hopefully come to an agreement, enact it, and then let us go try to go out and get some business.
And I responded, my first response, this seemed pretty good, because I've been a believer for as long as I've been here, that, if you want to bring business into town, you have to give incentives.
Providence
And
is
better-
doing it.
Right, exactly.
And-
So what I did was, once I looked at it, and then we happened to have a meeting for the event coming up in October, and I asked the town manager, I asked Fred, what do you think of this? And his initial response, and I'm not holding that you could change your mind, Fred, but I don't like it, right? And so, I mean, those would be my immediate people I would go to. I would go to the town planner. I would go to Mark. I would go to our manager, who was a former town planner, and find out specifically what don't they like about this. And what would they change if they could change? And talking to not a lot of people, because a lot of people, their eyes glaze over as soon as you start talking about this stuff. But those two provisions, I think, jumped right out. But as you said, they're fairly, they can be changed at any time. It's just a draft, whatever.
Sure,
But
and-
I would like to hear from our manager what he feels generally about it, and then specifically.
Sure, I'll be happy to
what
sit
you'd
down.
like to see.
Sure.
I just want to leave you on this last point. So,
Sure.
we did have Commerce RI come down and address the agency. Or we did a RFP for developers to come forward with proposals. This was one that was given to us as a framework, and we've changed and modified it. We did go to the General Assembly. We've had public hearings on the matter, so we've tried to be transparent, open about the process and what we're proposing. And as we said all along, that ultimately the final decision will be made by the town council, and that we're open to ideas and suggestions. So, thank you.
Can I ask one other question on the second from the last bullet on the executive summary? If the property is leased, they would pay the 6% annual net operating income every year? They would pay that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it would be every year until
Yeah.
what
It
the
would-
sale,
Yes,
price would be paid,
it would be in
6%.
exchange for the tax incentive. Now, if you're giving
because they
somebody...
could lease this property forever.
I know that. That's why instead of just a sale, we put a lease in there. The part that I clearly agree with your solicitor, Williamson, is the 6% of the annual net operating. So is that the gross, is that the, minus the profit, minus the CAM charges, or minus whatever, but those were looked at as recapture benefits back to the town, because the town would be giving somebody a substantial tax break. And it's not just on the real estate taxes, it's on the automobile taxes and the inventory taxes.
My question to that would, how do we enforce that year to year? And how do we know, I know we've asked for books before from people we've leased, and it was almost impossible to see them. So,
That's,
The
that,
penalty would be, the agreement would be null and void if in fact those
Tax
documents.
returns.
exactly, I was just going to say that. All of those corporations are very heavily regulated. They have to file a tax return, so it's pretty, you can ask for a copy of a Schedule C. You can have an accountant certify, and that's a big deal now, because the federal government has passed laws when accountants certify stuff, it has to be there. And you can ask for audits, and you can ask for third parties, as long as a developer knows that going in, that, if you want to have this benefit, you have to send us certified records every year to qualify. That's how the state does it. When you have to hire so many people at a certain income, the CFO has to certify it, or the treasurer has to certify it, and also your outside accountant has to certify it. So it can be done with very little burden to the town infrastructure. It's not going to have your town treasurer, your town finance director going through books. They would receive an audit. They would look at the audit, and it would be a certification and an audit process, both internal and external.
thank you. Fred?
Thank you. I'll sit down.
My issues with this are just what Council Vice President Girouda stated, those two bullets where it talks about the 7.5% of the gross sales price, or the 6% of the annual net operating income from a lease. I just don't feel that those are appropriate incentives for a town to be offering to a developer. It's very common for towns to do tax agreements, phase-in taxes, freezing tax proportion. Those are all very common tools. This seems a bit out of the ordinary, and I'm not usually against something that's out of the ordinary just for that reason, but another reason why I'm not too fond of this particular approach is that it's impossible to budget for. Whereas if you look at like the Royal Mills agreement the town had, that was a long-term tax agreement, but you could tell in year 17 what we were going to be receiving, and you could budget for that. Whereas, if you have a development take place tomorrow and it's a $20 million development, I can't tell you with any amount of certainty what we're going to be getting next year. So it just makes it very difficult from a financial standpoint for us to. And there's so much opportunity for things to go that are out of our control when you're talking about a sale. I just don't like it. That's my opinion, but yeah.
It's a great idea, but I don't know what felt would be a go for it.
Yeah.
If you build that adjustment into the tax incentive.
in simplicity and like just make sure it's kind of set. We need to make sure that we're not convoluting the process. We need to make sure that we're not convoluting the process for the town in terms of budgeting and for the developer. So, I agree. And obviously, I'm not in development or anything like that, so I definitely seek the expertise of the town planner and the town manager on
The
this.
same thing would hold true with the developer as far as how they're going to do their books, right? And, what they're going to be paying, what they've sold and whatnot, they're going to be in the same boat as us, wouldn't they?
Any other questions? I think for budget planning, Fred, I mean, maybe you would have to, not plan on using it that fiscal year. It would be funding for the next fiscal year for budget planning.
But, and then I think back to, Dave talked about, well, what if this council's not here? You've got a whole nother council, 5 years from now when the sale happens. All I can think back to is when that big tower at the top of the hill
Oh, yeah.
got sold, and, so I just think, it just opens up an opportunity for, on several fronts to have mismanagement of funds, and I just think it's much cleaner if you have a straight tax incentive, which all developers are used to by now. I mean, and all the state incentives that were mentioned by Attorney Sakarchi are all available in this zone as it stands. So what we're talking about is to add on to those state incentives, and I think we can, and I'm fine with saying, up to 20 years for an agreement, and I'm fine with saying even the possibility of doing a pilot. I just don't like the idea of specifying any kind of particulars like this, particularly when it talks about making a profit on a sale, a commercial sale outside of any of our control. Because you could have a developer come in and sell it to his
Son.
cousin for pennies on the dollar, and then he'll turn around and sell it back to him.
Well, there's got to be obviously a bona fide transaction, arm's length. I mean, all that stuff, that's where,
Yeah.
if documents aren't provided to the town, the deal's done. So for example, going back to the tax issue, if in fact a company doesn't turn over their books within X amount of days, the deal's gone. And they can't really seek an extension unless they filed something. So you have control over it. The same thing would happen there.
Very messy, though.
Well,
Trying to.
you know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's happened before, and you look out by anticipating that it's going to happen. So in the ordinance itself, or in any of the documents regarding the tax stabilization agreement, all the parties are going to be told beforehand, if in fact this is attempted, please be advised that the agreement is null and void within, 90 days of an invalid sale or something that's not a bona fide transaction.
And they're going to argue it is a bona fide transaction. Then we're going to go be in a legal battle. You know what I'm saying? It just overcomplicates something that should be pretty simple.
Then I can't mention anything else.
We're kind of going through that with a piece of property right here in Arctic, no.
Well, again, it's, you know how unscrupulous some people can be. And they'll do whatever they can do to get around paying their fair share.
That's why, just with just the authority to have the 20-year sliding scale, you can make the incentive what the incentive needs to be just through that. You don't need to convolute the process with all these different.
Front-loaded, like an insurance policy. Get it all up front and give them the balance on the back end.
Whatever. You can make it work as you want to make it work, but I agree.
Well,
That's very interesting.
We've come
That's
up
very
with a few
interesting,
suggestions
doing
here,
it that way.
changes.
You know,
But where's the
I
wow
think each
factor
council
to
member
get
should
them
send
to
over their
where's the
suggestions to
wow
Fred.
factor?
Fred, get these back, I'd say by no later than Wednesday. So Fred can get it back to the authority, and then they can come back with a proposed ordinance. What do you think?
I'll make more.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest, that we'd like to hear from you as a group and individually, and we can take all of that feedback in and go in and restructure as necessary. Just to touch on one point that Councilman Giroux mentioned, the first version of the ordinance, when he responded to that, didn't include a provision for the stable payment based on the pre-assessment annually over the years. And we added that in as a result of that feedback. So that is an aspect that we took under consideration and incorporated back into this ordinance. The initial ordinance was zero payment to the town. And Fred also mentioned to me his concern about, and if you've ever managed a budget, a town's budget, and a large budget, certainty is important in budgeting.
That's why the
And it's-
windmills are so
It's extremely important in municipal, in government budgeting, because there's no way to recoup if you've over budgeted. If you have high
Or
expectations.
you create a void,
Well,
something that you had one year.
You're not allowed to
and
run a
next year,
deficit,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
you've got to cut. So clearly understand the requirement, and so we've already taken steps in that direction. It's good feedback, and it's correct.
The other thing I didn't see any protection on was if the individual or the company goes bankrupt. Belly up after they make this giant development. What happens? We've seen that happen.
Yeah, and so if it goes into receivership, if there's an agreement there, the court will decide what happens, I think, at that point, but,
That's why
yeah,
front loading is much more
yeah,
important.
yeah.
Now, in the past, I've seen some developments where.
Oh,
they
and
built-
I
I
understand.
we
what
could
you're
use
saying.
Royal Mills as an example.
You-
They developed it, they went bankrupt, and then we're here negotiating tax agreements and tax credits with a new company or a receiver with a new company to buy that building over again.
Yeah.
It's a very real possibility, but you have to, you can sit here and worry about that happening, or you can, take a shot at it, and you can also end up with Belize Motors, who's by far more than bankruptcy. They're expanding in West Warwick. They want to do more business. They like doing business. They love Fred. They love this town. They're looking for another location. And much to my chagrin, someone who represents Warwick, they want to move some of their Warwick operations into West Warwick. So, I mean, you ultimately, it comes down to you making the decision, you as a council, when that applicant comes before you, and that applicant is either proposing a Taco Bell or a MetLife, or somewhere in between, you have to make that ability.
I like
We have-
tacos.
Yeah, I do too. Unfortunately, they like me a lot more than I like them. And we as an agency would do the first round of vetting and make a recommendation, but ultimately the council, you'll decide. If you think it's some business and some entity that you want here, then you should give them the best possible deal, because I'll tell you something, if you're not going to do it, if it's a good community like a Metropolitan, somebody else will.
Yep, exactly, and I think that's the point. There is always risk involved. There's been risk over the years, and sometimes we've lost, and sometimes we've won. He just gave a perfect example. You were losing, you're winning. But we've been giving tax incentive agreements for years. The formula hasn't changed in years. We need to do something. Obviously, we're not doing everything that we should be doing because we're not getting businesses knocking on our door coming into town. We need something, I don't know, something like a wow factor here in this agreement so that, business will look at this and say, wow, the other cities aren't offering this. This is something we might want to look into. And I've been, preaching this, I think, from the first day, that we need incentives to get, companies in here. And as the economy gets better, it gets even tougher and tougher. Yes, that's the problem. We're behind the 8 ball right now. We need to catch up, and we need to do something.
Never, I will say this, Mr. Kruger was the plan at Warwick for 20-some odd years. Never, Warwick, all that development on Route 2, never, ever, ever gave a tax treaty until May of this year. They put a 10-year ordinance in effect. And now, 3 months later, they're expanding it. So what does that tell you? The
Right.
city of Providence used to give them hodgepodge. They passed an ordinance now. They've got the Propashanti Hotel moving. It's happening. Other communities are. Massachusetts is. I mean, you've got to get in the game.
All right, again,
Absolutely.
I think we'll send over the suggestions to Fred. Just send them over individually. I think we all shared our opinions here tonight, what we would like to see. Just get them over to Fred so he has a bullet point, and then they can work on it and probably have it ready for the
Bring it
next
back
council
to you
meeting.
for the next meeting, so thank you.
I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the agency. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Any other
Thank you very
questions?
much.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. 2-minute recess. Yeah. It's a lot of tough situations at that.